I'm turning on recording. So this is going to be recorded, just so you all know, and it'll be available afterwards. Usually I put these up on YouTube, uh, and I'll send you an email when they are up. Um, so tonight it's strategic crop planning and variety selection for high tunnels. And I'm Emily. I'm from New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. Our mission is to foster resilience in local, regional, and national food systems by training a new generation of farmers to produce food that is nutritious, culturally connected, and accessible to all individuals. We have three main project areas. We have farmer training, we do work in food access, and we also do national outreach. Tonight we're in the farmer training section, so hooray. Welcome to one of our workshops. If you can introduce yourself in the chat, and if you can change your name to include your pronouns if you'd like. But add to the chat your name, your pronouns, your farm name, and where you're located so we can get to know each other. I always like to see where people are coming from. I'm in Massachusetts, but I'm hoping one day I'll find someone in Alaska. And I think I did the other day, which was really fun. This is being recorded, just so you know. And thank you for showing up tonight. We do sometimes like being able to see people's faces to see if they're enjoying this or not, but if you're eating, no pressure, you don't have to turn on your camera. We ask you to help us help you. We are going to have a survey at the end of the workshop. It should pop up once you close out of the webinar. It'll just kind of like pop up in a browser window. It's only 5 questions. It's really, really short. I make them as short as possible. It's something that our funders like to see. They want to see if we are making a difference with the workshops. It helps us know if the workshops are helpful for you. And it helps keep our workshops free and funded. So we love that. I'm also going to put up a quick survey right now just to kind of get an idea of where everyone is at with their high tunnel production. Let's see. So the question is just, where are you at with your high tunnel production? Are you a new tunnel grower learning the ropes? Do you have some experience and you're learning to grow? Or do you have a lot of experience and you're looking to fine tune? And I'll leave that up for a couple minutes while I continue the introduction. This is one of many workshops in this series on high tunnels. Tonight we're here with strategic crop planning and variety selection. This is the 4th one, and we have 4 more to go. The next one is on creating the best growing conditions in your high tunnels, and that one is up on the website and open for registration if you're interested in it. And then we also have one on pests in your high tunnels, diseases in high tunnels, and exploring new markets and keeping good records, which is always a fun thing to learn about. Other upcoming events, we have a food safety plan, writing a food safety plan for your farm coming up at the end of the month. The workshops for this workshop series are on the 2nd Tuesday of every month. And then we also have a high tunnel tour coming up at Farmer Dave's, which should be pretty fun. He's got, I think, like an acre that he puts under cover, which is pretty exciting. New Entry is also doing a benchmarking study. You can get paid to share your financial records with us. So we're recruiting small-scale vegetable farmers that have 2+ years of growing experience to participate in our benchmarking study. We're trying to help improve farmers' business management and record-keeping practices and give you guys a way to compare your performance against other producers at similar scales. There's a lot of USDA information on large-scale growers or commodity growers, but not a lot of information on small-scale growers. So if you've ever wondered, am I making as much money as my neighbor is? Should I be making more money? Am I getting the amount of profits that I should be getting? Then this is a great study for you to join. You'll also get a sheet about how you compare to the other farmers in the study, which is pretty cool. So if you're interested in that, you can drop your email address in the chat, or you can contact, I'm not Julian, I'm Emily, but you can contact Julian or me, and we can get you set up to join the study if you're eligible. And a quick thanks to our funder, Northeast Extension Risk Management Education, through USDA. So thank you everyone who's answered the poll. And I'll just take a quick look. It looks like about 38% of you are new growers, 38% of you are some experience, and then a good quarter of you have a lot of experience and are looking to fine tune. So we're all over the map today. But if you're feeling like you're newer, you have no idea what you're doing, don't worry, you're probably not alone. And if you feel like you know everything, throw something in the chat if you think of something, and maybe we can learn from you too. All right, I'm going to hand it over now to Sue and Emma, and they're going to get their presentation started.
Okay. Does that look great?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, take it away, Emma.
Oh, okay. Hey, everybody. I'm Emma. And Sue's on the other screen. She's going to be controlling the slides. So thank you so much, Emily, for organizing this and for everyone for attending. Let's get into it. Next slide, Sue. So first, we just want to highlight that there is no right way. There's going to be no one prescription or panacea for every tunnel or for every crop or for that's going to work in every state or every season. So we're going to give you some general guidelines. I'm going to tell you some varieties that I think are generally a really good idea. And Sue's going to give you some best practices and other tips and tricks. And we're going to talk about examples of just stuff we see on other farms that we visit. And the rest is going to be up to you. You know, tunnel growing in particular, farming in general, but tunnel growing in particular is really something you have to figure out on your own and experiment with and take a lot of notes. And yeah, so next slide. So who the heck are we? So I am Emma Golonka. I work for Johnny's Selected Seeds. The company's based in Maine. I work from my home in Massachusetts, and I'm the commercial grower representative in New England. So my kind of area of expertise, I guess, is going to be variety selection. I work with growers doing trials, and I work closely with our research farm in Maine and the team there. So our research team is about a dozen members of the research team who are experts in specific crops and do trialing. Last year, I think we trialed close to 3,000 varieties across all of the crops that we carried. And that information ends up on the website in our growers library, and also is how we decide what varieties make it into the catalog and which don't. We also do some breeding in fruiting crops and flowers this year. And Sue works with UMass Extension. I'll let her in a couple of slides maybe speak to her own introduction, but I'm sure a lot of you are really familiar with UMass Extension and the work that they do. A lot of research, and they put out a lot of great information. So next slide. Okay, so why grow in a tunnel? The pros of growing in a tunnel are going to be season extension. So you can get something in earlier, you can have a crop go later. It's protected. Climate change is just making everything more and more variable. So you can control water, you can control heat, you can control humidity to some degree. You have a little bit better control over, fertility, and that protection is going to bring you higher quality produce, which hopefully you can get higher prices for. Next slide. Okay, and why is growing in a tunnel hard? It can be expensive. There's initial input. You have to build the tunnel. You have to maintain the tunnel. If you want to do it, you have to install electric and you have to maintain that. You have to worry more if there's wind or snow or extreme weather, especially if you're trying to go through the winter. For some of these crops we'll discuss, especially trellised ones like tomatoes or cucumbers, there's added labor when it comes to trellising. And then there's also just pests and diseases that are specific to tunnels. And that's another problem in and of itself. So I think it's your turn now, Sue.
Yeah, that's a good segue. I'm Sue Scheufele. I'm with the vegetable program at UMass Extension and specialize on pest management and vegetable production. But we have a team of other folks who cover different areas. So yeah, it's nice to be here and see some familiar faces, some new faces. I think that my take home message, if there is one, and Emma alluded to this already, is that we can't really tell you what to do. Like, you're not going to leave here with a plan, unfortunately, maybe. But there's just so many different decisions that you have to make along the way. Planting these crops, whether or not you have heat or labor through the winter, all those factors influence how you're going to set up any crop in your tunnel. And so it's just, there's so much variability. It's a little bit hard to figure out how to frame this talk, but I think my message is to kind of figure out what you want to grow and when you need it, and kind of work back from there to figure out your plan. So that might be crops that you just enjoy growing, things that you grow well, or things that you have a good market for. I definitely encourage folks to, before you plant a crop, figure out where you're going to sell it. So who are your customers and when do they want this product? Here's sort of just an example that I stole from a farm. Maybe you're here, hello. But knowing your window will help you work backwards from there. You want to think about how you're spacing things out in time over the course of the year, or maybe several years. So this is sort of a quick and dirty calendar that I made. Say you have 3 years in a tunnel. You might start your tomatoes in March and then have those growing through September before you then plant a winter crop in October that might grow through March. Maybe you want to rotate from year to year, so encouraging folks to do that where they can. So here's cucumbers in year 2, leaving some room maybe in there for these spots in yellow, cover cropping possibly. Can you fit that in before a cucumber crop, or leaving the tunnel fallow over the winter or even a summer? Here's some nice pictures of folks deciding to take tunnels out of production so that they can improve their soil health in the tunnel. These tunnels do, when we treat them like this and we have stuff planted in there all year, every year, they do get worn out. And so finding little ways to fit in cover crops is always good. Okay, so we're going to go through just a couple examples of the bigger crops that folks are growing. So tomatoes, cukes, and winter spinach, and try to just go through some of the things that you all should be thinking about. And again, let's start with your goals. Again, who are your customers? What do they want and when do they want it? Other goals you might have, just to get earlier crops out. You might have a particular disease on your farm that makes it hard to grow in the field. All these crops, you can grow them in the field. So what is motivating you to put them in the tunnel? Is it just the yield? Is it because you want an early market? Or are there just, maybe in the case of cucumbers, varieties that you can't grow in the field, like the English types? I put peppers and eggplants here. Folks do sometimes do those in the tunnel. And I think, again, those are things that grow pretty well in the field, but there might be, again, a disease that you can control better in the more controlled environment of the tunnel. Getting colored bell peppers can be hard because they have a lot of pests. So other things to think about there. And then importantly, just like what fits into your system across the farm. So a lot of you are probably growing right in the soil, but I don't have a picture here, but many folks also make raised beds or grow in bags of potting media. some people will invest in heat where others don't have heat. Think about your source of water. A lot of tunnels might be on town water, but that comes with its own challenges. And just like growing anything in the tunnel, there's a lot of opportunity to control the environment, but like Emma alluded to, there's a certain suite of pests that really thrive in there. And that has a lot to do with just it's dry, as in no falling rain, but very humid. And so you really need to make sure you have adequate circulation and ventilation. Automating things can really improve your ability to do all of this well: irrigation, fertigation, circulating and venting. You can automate a lot of that. And that might make sense, especially if you're limited in your labor supply. These crops are very labor intensive, so something to, think about ahead of time. Do you have the labor to do grafted double leader tomatoes and all the pruning that comes with that? Or do you want to keep it a little more simple since you don't have the time? So just, these are all the things that go into your high tunnel crop planning that I can't give you the answer to.
Cool. So now we'll talk a little bit about, we're going to dive right into tomatoes, and I'm going to talk you through some variety selection. And then we're going to go backwards a little bit because Sue's going to talk about why you would choose those varieties in the first place, I think. But first things first, in variety selection. So before you choose the variety, Johnny's has to choose the variety to make it into the Johnny's catalog, or any seed company needs to do that. And so our research team and our specialists are making those decisions based on kind of a checklist almost. So you open up the Johnny's catalog and you'll notice that there's a greenhouse tomato section and then there's a field tomato section. And you can grow whatever you want in the tunnel and it will be probably a little bit happier than it was in the field, but there are specific varieties that are produced for higher input systems that you will get more bang for your buck for. And that is kind of how those are denoted. So first things first, to kind of get that nod, is disease resistance. So leaf mold is sort of a baseline requirement for it to make its way, for a variety to make its way into our catalog or into the greenhouse lineup. Next is really any other disease you can think of, the more the better in the package. So powdery mildew, gray leaf spot are really high on our list, but the bigger and better the disease package, the better. Next, we want really high quality seed across lots, and we want to work with vendors that we can trust and rely on. So vendor relationships are important for us, for other companies that are breeding these varieties. Johnny's does some tomato breeding, but we don't breed all of the tomatoes by any means. So good plant habit. You want a manageable plant. You don't want something that's too vegetative and has so much leaf cover that you can't find your fruits, and you don't want something that's so generative that it's spindly and your trusses are breaking because it can't handle the fruit load. We want a vigorous plant with high yield potential, meaning if it is well managed, if the fertility is well managed and disease is managed, it's going to yield consistently and you're going to get high yields throughout a long season. High heat set, tunnels obviously can be a little bit warmer, especially in the heat of summer. And so we want flowers that can pollinate and tolerate those higher temperatures. And we also want varieties that can set fruit in those higher temperatures. Uniform plants are important. So some, poor varieties are going to have high variability across plants. So you're going to have one plant that's kind of normal, another plant that it's called going blind, when it loses that apical growth and just kind of stops growing. It doesn't have a growth point anymore. And then you have a weird spindly one. And so uniformity, so kind of can go hand in hand with seed quality, but they're a little bit different. And then last, you obviously want good fruits. We want good flavor, good appearance. like a low level of culls, high quality, high uniformity. And when we're trialing varieties, we're often trialing them for years at a time. It's rare that a variety will be trialed once. So we're able to see how varieties are performing across multiple years and lots of conditions before making that decision. Next slide. Okay, so tomato varieties. First, we'll just jump right into the red beefsteaks because they're a big sector. So Geronimo and Big Dina are kind of our #1 tried and true varieties. They set fruit reliably. They taste good for this segment of like indeterminate greenhouse types. They have a good strong disease package, good vigor, a really balanced plant. They're easy to work with. Rebelski is worth mentioning. It's a little bit smaller, it can be kind of flat, but it still performs well and it's available reliably. Next slide. Which brings us to Big Dina. So if you're a tunnel grower, you might be familiar with Big Dina or the lack thereof the last couple of years. So one reason that Big Dina has had issues, I guess, in the last couple of years, and going forward, we're trying to identify subs, is you may be familiar with tomato brown rugose. It's a new disease. Sue probably knows more details than me, but it's been in the US, it's been found in the US for a couple of years now. And so breeders are really worried about this because where the money is for breeding is in really high-tech systems where these plants are being grown for like months on end. And so breeders are kind of turning over their lineups to have resistance because that's what their main buyers for these types of seeds are requiring. Meaning varieties like Big Dina and Rebelski might not be long for this world. So just take note of that. I think like a good thing when you find something like that out where a variety that you really like might be going away is to start working on subs now. So say you usually grow 1,000 Rebelski, try growing 50 seeds of just another variety because you're building yourself an insurance plan that way. But Big Dina specifically hasn't been available the last several years because the seed production's been really poor. And so Geronimo is a good sub. Johnny's going to continue to produce or contract out productions of Geronimo as long as we're able. But that's kind of where the breeding world is going and why some you see just in general varieties, but specifically these ones go away sometimes. Okay, next slide. So some alternatives that we've added or identified. So I guess I actually want to go back and just mention that one reason that there's not a lot of subs or like specific one-to-one Big Dina subs available is that they just don't taste very good. There's a few subs out there. We've trialed several of them. And a member of our research team lovingly refers to them as window smashers because they're the kind of like beautiful red fruits that you see in the supermarket, but they're made for shipping. They're hard. They taste like cardboard. They're just not super pleasant. So it's really been a challenge for us to identify a high producing substitute for something like Big Dina that actually tastes good. Okay, go forward, please, Sue. Thanks. So Cayman is one alternative. It's going to be a little bit more generative than Big Dina or Geronimo, kind of more compact than Geronimo. It's going to be earlier than both of them, meaning it's also going to taper off a little bit earlier. And speaking of, if you do want something really early, like one reason to grow in a tunnel is first to market. So if you want to be like first to market, try Ruby Dawn. It's 60 days. But that trade-off where it comes on earlier and it also will taper off a little bit earlier.
Quick question for you, Emma.
Yep.
What does generative mean?
Generative, so vegetative means the plant is more leafy, and generative means it's generating more, so it has more fruits.
Thank you.
So a plant will lead towards making more of one or the other.
Okay, awesome.
Cool. Okay, next slide. So determinants are a good option if you want a faster turnover. Like Sue mentioned, it would be really ideal if you could cover crop some. So whereas with indeterminates, they're going to be in there for a long time. You're going to have a little bit more labor in just continuing to trellis and prune them. Determinants, you don't have to prune them if you don't want to. You can prune for better airflow. You can prune up to, the leader below the first cluster, but you don't have to. A lot of people don't do that. Determinants are easy. You just stake them. They're in there. They won't yield quite as long, of course, but they're going to be a really good option. I see them in the tunnel a lot. Anytime you do tomatoes in the tunnel, they're going to be happier than they're going to be outdoors. Our first choice is going to be BHN 589, and that's kind of our number one determinant. It's reliable. It's going to yield really high. It's technically a semi-determinant, so the plant is a little bit lankier. It's going to yield a little bit longer because it has more plant matter. It's going to photosynthesize more, so you're going to collect more sugars. So the fruits are going to taste a little bit better than other determinate varieties. This one will taper out in size a little bit later. So your later fruits you're gonna get a lot of smaller ones. So if that matters to you, just take note. This year, Johnny's added STM 2255. This variety's been around a few years. Most companies carry it. It's a really good greenhouse performer. It does well in the field as well. It has a really good heat set and a good disease package. It actually tastes pretty good, and the fruits are really good size. Another one is called Firebird, which I saw several times in the last couple of years. I think Seedway might be the only one to carry it, but this one is really well known for having good heat set. It's got a good disease package and really big fruits. And then other ones that Johnny's carry, so I can't speak to their characteristics quite as much, but are really, really popular and for good reason, are something like Primo Red or Red Deuce. Next. So next is we're moving away from kind of those classic red ones a little bit, or a class that we call, internally at least, we call high looms. And these are hybrid heirloom types. So you're going to get like the modern disease package and the vigor of a hybrid variety, but you're going to get that heirloom look that you can charge more money for. You get the colors, you get the ribs, you get all those attractive features. And this is a segment that's really popular for breeding. So we have plenty of kind of new options to choose from and lots of fun stuff. One that Johnny's has carried for a while is the Mar series. So it's our French heritage. It's like the Marbon, Margold, Marnero, Marnor. They're all listed here. The seed is kind of expensive, honestly, but they're as long as you treat the plants well, they will be worth it, especially if you're comparing to a traditional heirloom tomato. Another kind of series of varieties is, so Enzazad in their organic sector Vitalis carries the Mixologist series. So this is organic seed, which is nice because the Mar series, the French Heritage series, is not. We carry Gin Fizz, which is a cheaper option to Margold. That's worth trying next to one another. Other ones that you can find are something like Cuba Libre, they have Mai Tai. We carry Ana Rosa, which is a really good heat set variety. But there's a lot out there in this class that are worth trying, especially if you can kind of have a market for heirloom types. All right, next slide. And then just some cherries. People love doing cherries in the tunnel. And I think cherries are really worth it, especially with these high yielding varieties that we have. And you can charge a pretty good penny for a pie of cherries. I think Sun Peach is great. It's a pink match to Sun Golds, but it's better for indoor growing. It has leaf mold resistance. The truss is long, but the plants are balanced and healthy. They're really crack tolerant, and I don't really care for tomatoes, but I really love Sun Peach. They taste really good. And then Sakura is super popular. I think it's probably the #1 cherry tomato, other than maybe Sun Gold, that my growers are doing. It's really high yielding, really crack tolerant, and has good leaf mold resistance.
Emma, the Sun Peach is the one on the right.
Yes, correct.
Just checking.
Sorry, they both look very red in that picture.
Oh, okay. Do you have any questions for Emma before we transition to sort of like tomato planning and production?
I just want to echo that I also love the Sun Peach. They are so tasty.
I love them.
Nice.
I'm seeing there's a question in the chat asking if you can talk a little bit more about the vegetative versus generative, and then there's a couple other questions. Oh, and for the more on the vegetative versus generative, is there a balance point for them? And then I'll have another question after that one.
Okay. Those are really good questions. So like I guess in a general sense, some plants just tend to be leafier, and some plants tend to be not. I'm sure you guys have grown varieties before where it's just really like lanky and ridiculous looking. And you have really long internodes. There's like a foot between clusters and the plants are falling over and they're just really spindly. So that is definitely not a generative plant. So it's just kind of like almost an internal term that we use when assessing plants. Other than kind of like climate and growing conditions, you should be able to kind of like alter those qualities some through fertility management, but also grafting is a really common way to do that. So we carry 3 rootstocks. One of them is more balanced, and then one of them is more for generative growth, pushing generative growth, and one of them is more for pushing vegetative growth. So depending on your needs, you can affect that a bit through grafting if needed. But we wouldn't add a variety into our catalog that was kind of like how I described, like a really silly, lanky plant or something that was so bushy that you couldn't find the fruits. And oftentimes if that's happening too, it could be, if a plant is so bushy like that, or, you're getting like leaf curl and stuff, like you probably just over fertilized it too. So we try really hard to add really well-balanced varieties to our catalog at least.
Thank you.
That's a good explanation. There's like a genetic component to it, and then there's also ways that you can influence it with fertility and environmental controls.
Thank you. That also answers why I don't see some of my favorite weird heirlooms in the Johnny's catalog. It's because they look terrible.
There's even some varieties like I'm kind of fond of, but they wouldn't make the cut for the Johnny's catalog, no matter how much.
Yep. Okay. The next question is, there's one person who plants the same variety in their high tunnel and in their field, but they are often finding that the ones in the tunnel get tougher skin. Is there a reason for this?
Sue, do you have?
No.
Yeah.
Size, the environment is different, and the water and sun.
I could see it being related to the humidity somehow, but my brain would need to turn a little bit more for that one.
All right. Then the next question is if you can repeat the organic tomatoes that you mentioned.
Oh, sure. Like the Highlands. In there, I was talking about this mixologist series. So I think High Mowing carries most of them because they're organic. We carry the Gin Fizz, but there's Mai Tai, Cuba Libre, and Rosa is one that Johnny's carries, and I believe High Mowing as well. Next year they're coming out with a brown one, which hoping we're going to pick up. It's really, really nice. But that's not, I don't even know if that has a name yet. So
Who does all the taste testing for the tomatoes in the trials?
that's our tomato specialist. His name is Dan. He's our tomato expert, and he does a lot of tomato testing. But
Lucky Dan.
Yeah.
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. But if you guys have them, just feel free to put them in the chat whenever, and when there's an appropriate time, I will ask them out for you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so now we're gonna get into kind of planning and production of tunnel tomatoes, and I'll just say that it was a little challenging to put this together on the heels of the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference, which happened last month in New Hampshire. And there were just like a lot of good talks on tunnel management and tomatoes and tunnels. And so I have a link to it later, but a lot of that stuff will be up online shortly. And so I tried not to duplicate things that were covered there. Thinking a lot of you would have probably been there, but so with that said, when it comes to figuring out like your timing of tomato planting, you need to think about these different factors that I have kind of listed out here. The first is, do you have supplemental heat in your tunnel? And are you planning on grafting? And you want to think about, do you have the labor that is needed to grow indeterminate tomatoes, or are you growing determinate tomatoes? And even think about your trellising system ahead of time, because all of these things will be factors in calculating your plant density and how many plants you need, and also the timing. So for example, starting here with like the simplest tunnel with no heat, and not grafting, but growing indeterminate tomatoes, you could plant earlier than your last frost date, but it would be just as risky as planting in the field before the last frost date. And at least a couple of years ago, we did have a May 15 or 18 frost, and people had tomatoes planted outside and they were affected by the frost. So in a tunnel, the nighttime temperature is the same inside the tunnel as it is outside, basically. So if you were planting before this without heat, you would want to cover with row cover those tomatoes. And this would be kind of your working backwards seeding date and harvest window. If you have heat, maybe we're kind of jumping to maybe the most advanced system where you do have heat, and you also have light. So thinking about the seeding date, unless you have supplemental lighting, you really don't want to be seeding before February. And that's because of the daylight intensity is just too, it's just not intense enough without supplemental lighting. But if you do have those things, you can get away with seeding in January. If you're grafting, that will add time to the transplant production. So it takes longer to get to your planting date, but you could be harvesting as early as mid-May, if that's your goal. A lot of people don't have supplemental lighting. So, and in this case, if you are not grafting, this is probably a more common scenario where you're seeding around the 1st of February and planting in mid-March for a June harvest. So for those of you who are already doing this, I don't know if this jives with what you're currently doing, but I just identify some of these places where you can manipulate things to plant earlier. Adding lights, like Emma said, grafting, which we'll get to in a little bit, but some other things to think about when you're planting early. The larger the plant, the better, and you can warm the soil or make sure, or use like dark mulches here to warm the soil earlier, because you want the roots to establish and grow quickly. So cold soil is not ideal. You can add heat in the form of like warm water. And so some growers are doing that. And then when you're growing earlier, you might want to think about pollination, adding bees in the tunnel. Sort of jumping around here, but those factors, again, all go into calculating how many plants you need in your tunnel. So if you are, for example, doing indeterminate tomatoes that are not grafted, sorry, I don't know if you can see my pointer, Emily.
I can
see it.
see it. It's very small, but I also am trying to look up the tomato skin thickness at the same time as I'm looking at the screen.
Okay.
So that's probably why it's so small.
Okay. All right, so here's a couple different options for systems for growing tomatoes in these tunnels. Sort of the simplest, you have, you're just stringing them up 1 liter per plant. Here's sort of a recommended spacing, 18 inches in rows, 36 inches between. If you do that in a regular sort of 30 by 96 foot house, the recommendation is somewhere around 5 square feet per liter. So that comes out to be 640 plants. Compared with if you were doing a double liter system, which you might do, especially if you were grafting tomatoes, those plants are going to be so vigorous that if you just have 1 liter, it's just going to shoot up to the sky, and you can kind of slow it down by breaking it in half. That might change your spacing here. So the plants are 12 inches apart with a tighter in-row spacing to keep it at 5 square feet per liter. So then you only need 288 plants, but those are grafted plants, so they take a lot more effort to produce. We're not going to really talk about grafting other than, you know, when it fits in and how, but there are some great resources out there. I'm sure there's something on Johnny's website. This is just a group at Purdue that I've followed. They have some good resources on how to do it. The main reasons are that vigor, increased vigor and yield. If you are gonna use grafted plants, you know, you need to, there's a root stock and then the variety that you want on top, which is called the scion. They sometimes have different growth rates, so it can take a little bit of trial and error, but you want the plants to be the same size, the same width of the stem, about 2 millimeters, which takes about 2 to 3 weeks to grow. And then you're going to splice them together, and you know, you can get pretty good at doing this. And what's tricky is healing the plants. And you need to keep the plants in the dark at 100% humidity for a day or two, and then slowly increase the light and decrease the humidity over a couple of days while that wound heals. And so the trick can be like figuring out how to do that on the farm. And again, there are a bunch of other resources just on that. It's its own workshop, so we won't get into it other than it does affect, you know, your other decisions that you're making when you're planning. So a lot of you guys, you know, who said you are already doing this and have a lot of experience, some of this will be a review, but we also have a lot of beginners. So hopefully there's something for everyone in here. You want to start the tomatoes using like a heat mat. They want to be pretty warm. If you are grafting, I think one of the speakers I heard in December suggested doing kind of open trays so that you can pick and choose plants of the same width that will fit together more easily, and then kind of prick them out as you're potting up, as you're doing the grafts and potting up. So here's some pretty small, this is a 288, I think, cell tray. If you're here, Kevin, Thanks for letting me borrow your slides. From Langwater Farm. Yeah, so they start in 288, so not an open tray necessarily, but pretty small seedlings, and then eventually work up to these 4-packs. And his tip here was to make sure you space out the trays and give them enough room so that they aren't getting leggy. You see kind of a lot of leggy tomatoes going in. You want them to be as robust and vigorous and stocky as possible. So another thing I see, not just in the tunnel, in the field as well, is people are anxious to plant and are putting things out when it might be still too cold. So the soil needs to be over 60 degrees or the roots aren't gonna grow, and you're gonna have like slow sort of transplant shock and all of that. Here's a picture of someone growing in media. So these are black crates filled with potting mix instead of growing in soil. That could, reduce issues with soil-borne disease. You might have lots of reasons to do that versus growing in the soil. These are kind of just like things that I've seen over the years visiting lots of farms. Fertility recommendations in the tunnel are going to be really different, and we'll get into that in detail, but there was a relatively recent regional project looking at high tunnel tomato production, and they came up with a long-term soil test. I don't know how many of you are already doing this, but it's offered through the University of Maine Soil Lab. It just combines a routine field soil test and a saturated media test. And those two tests look at different kind of pools of nutrients in the soil. The routine test is kind of your reserve of nutrients, and the saturated media test is what is available right now to the plant. And so their recommendation is to look at both of these pieces of information. If you are more comfortable sending stuff to the UMass Soil Lab, we can do both of these tests, and we don't have a special name for it. I'm going to get into some more of this stuff on the next couple of slides, but I think my point for here is that the soil needs to be warm enough, the growing environment needs to be warm enough, but not too hot. We run into pollination issues when we get over 85 degrees, which is kind of lower than I expected. Think of these as sort of tropical plants, but over 85 degrees, you start to get issues with the pollen or just flowers aborting. And so I recommend to growers, once it's routinely over 85 in the tunnel, you can put 30% shade cloth over the whole thing. But also you, for many reasons, need to make sure you have enough circulation. So here is a row of horizontal airflow fans. And those help to move and mix the air around in the tunnel. But if you don't have enough of them, you'll get into lots of problems. Pollination is one, disease is another. These fans can also help with pollination. If you aim them at the crop, they just kind of shake things up. And that might be enough to pollinate your early season tomatoes. But here, this grower is got a lot of green fruit on here, April 25th. So nice and early. So this was the result of that study. The fertility recommendations hadn't been updated for the tunnel environment, and all we had were recommendations for field tomatoes, which are not growing in the same spot for 6 months, like these tunnel tomatoes are, and they're not as vigorous, they're not putting out as much fruit. So makes sense, we need to fertilize them more. This study came up with these recommendations. So it's different than we're used to thinking about for our crops. It sounds weird to say like your nitrogen needs depend on whether you want a low yield or a high yield. Like, who wants a low yield? Well, you might want a low yield if you're doing determinate varieties. And here, that's really what we're talking about is, I wish there was a different kind of scale here. But this might be, the low might be like determinate and so on and so forth. But Vern Grubinger at University of Vermont Extension gave a great talk on tunnel tweaks at the conference. So I'm not gonna cover everything he did. His talk will be up online in a few weeks. But he did a big survey of growers in New England and found that most were getting 2 pounds per square foot, and up to 5. So I'd say if you wanted to push yourself, 3 pounds per square foot is a good goal. And then what does that mean? So over here, you would need almost 7 pounds for every 1,000 square feet. So this ends up being like 2.5 times what was recommended in the guide for field tomatoes. And when we look at the potassium, you also do want to take into account the soil test result for potassium. So if you say you had medium or optimum potassium in your soil and you had that good yield goal, you would need 9 pounds of potassium per 1,000 square feet. For potassium, this is up to 8 times what we would recommend in the field. So nitrogen is, what the plant needs to create all the green tissue that supports the fruit, and potassium is, largely thought of as, the fruiting nutrient. So it makes sense that in these tunnels where we have so much fruit, we need a lot more potassium than we're giving our field crops. I just want to highlight that. Whoops. And so how do you do that? Here's a farm spreading compost, which is, important to think about soil health in these tunnels. But there's not that much nitrogen or potassium in this compost. So you're going to add more fertility as well. And you can do that pre-plant like they're doing here, but then you're also going to want to side dress or fertigate to get all of that nutrition to the plant all season long. And when we are putting that much fertility into these tunnels, we can end up with high salts. When you're adding compost here, year after year, you can get really high organic matter, and that just like changes the chemistry that's going on in there in a big way. And we can see really high pH in tunnels too. So just again, want to stress the importance of taking those soil tests, whether it's a routine test or the high tunnel test in particular. So again, there's like whole workshops just on fertigation. We had Judson Reed from Cornell do a workshop for us a couple of years ago, and I've watched it myself like 4 or 5 times. So I recommend it. It's here at this QR code. But basically, what we recommend is put down like half of the fertility up front in these cheaper granular forms, and then take the other half or the remaining fertilizer amount and divide that by the number of weeks that you're planning to harvest that crop. So then you have like a weekly fertilizer need that you pump through the irrigation water. So here's just like 2 different, this is a Mazzy injector. It's pretty simple to install. And then you have a dosatron here, which is a little more costly, but more precise. And, you know, you'll see deficiency symptoms in the plants, but if you do tissue testing, you can prevent problems. You can correct problems before they start affecting the yield and quality of the fruit. And so this is an illustration of how to take the tissue test. You walk through the tunnel and grab that 5th leaf. So it's kind of like the first leaf that is at 90-degree angle. And just grab a couple of those across the tunnel, put them in a bag, and ship them off to, in this case, the main soil lab is the one that does tissue testing. Our lab is currently not doing it. The way that I just described calculating the weekly fertilizer need, here is a recommendation from another guide. This is the Mid-Atlantic Vegetable Production Guide. This shows a little bit more in detail how we were talking about vegetative versus generative, and fruiting versus foliage. So you can see that over time, as we're fruiting, the crop needs more nitrogen and potassium. So that makes sense. And you could follow these guidelines, or again, other talks that have been recently given. Becky Madden gave I think it was called like low-hanging fruit, nutrient management in high tunnel tomato. And I like that message of just, you don't have to buy the state-of-the-art equipment and get into this very intensive dosatron fertigation system. You can just have a weekly amount and keep it the same throughout the season. And that's better than doing no fertigation or no side dressing. So if you're here because you want to bump it up to the next level, like, those are some of the things that you can think about. And irrigation, just for the same reason, the same rationale. The plants are just so big and they're making so much fruit. What we recommend in the field doesn't really stand. So, okay, a tomato plant needs 1 or 1.5 inches of rain. It's going to need, I don't know, much more than that. So people often ask, we say, water more frequently. We say, how frequently? Am I watering frequently enough? If you can water a little bit each day, that's ideal. If you can water 3 times a week, that's better than once a week. You know, tomatoes, if you want a nice uniform tomato with no cracks, then you need nice uniform water. And the nutrients get into the plant through the water. So if you don't want blossom end rot, then you need nice, uniform, consistent moisture for consistent growth. One of the things, again, in that tomato study they found was 1 drip line per bed is just not enough for these high production systems. Here's like this table is showing how much time it takes for 1 inch of water. Say you have a high flow drip tape with 8-inch spaced emitters. It's going to take 4 hours to apply 1 inch of water. You can cut that by adding more drip lines. So you could have up to 4 drip lines per bed, and now you can run those lines for a shorter amount of time and get the same amount of water, and you can do a little bit each day. Use of timers makes this a lot easier. So if you, I should put a picture of the timer, but there are these like very simple battery powered things that you can make a program like turn on for 1 hour every day from 7 to 8 in the morning or whatever. And then you can adjust as you need. You can get a little fancier and use these soil moisture sensors. And I've been working with growers to use these in tunnels, and I think it's surprising. Like in the early season, I had folks who were wanting to overwater because well, they think the plants need water, but it's gray and it's cold and they're not growing that fast. You might need less water than you think, and with more limited water due to climate change, you don't want to over apply. That also may come into play if you have soil-borne diseases. You don't want to overwater and create a conducive situation. So, but then you also definitely want to water enough, and these sensors can take some of the guesswork out. When you're growing tomatoes, the sensors are like 12 and 24 inches deep in the soil. So there's no way that you can put your finger in the soil and do your, finger test and know what's happening that deep down. There's just a lot more information. And once you learn how to do it, it really doesn't take much time to check the sensors each day or once a week. Probably going on way too much. Here's a picture from Vern of this 4 lines per bed as opposed to 1.
Quick question, Sue.
Mhm.
Oh, perfect. You have the question slide up. There's a question, what was the additional fertigation resource titled, the one with the low-hanging fruit? And then somebody answered that maybe it was the fertigation webinar by Justin Reed.
Yeah, so there's a couple resources, and I think Emma and I were talking about this, putting together a list of links that we could send to you to share to everybody would probably be the easiest way. There's a fertigation webinar. Becky Madden from University of Vermont Extension gave a presentation on the low-hanging fruit at the recent New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference in New Hampshire, and that will get up online, I think, when I get to it. And then there was another resource, which is a printed. We have looking for my copy of it. It's not here. The New England Vegetable Management Guide. Other regions have their own, and they have their different strengths and weaknesses. So I often turn to the Mid-Atlantic Vegetable Management Guide for those fertigation tables. That's something we don't have in our guide. So
Thank you. Yeah, and if you guys have links, I will absolutely share them out with everyone. So thank you for any links you send. Then there's another question. Let's see. Are there any, I think it's grafted cherry tomatoes that do well in tunnels?
I don't usually recommend grafting for cherry tomatoes because they're so vigorous already, but you could try it.
All right, those are the questions I see right now. Are there any other questions that people are having? Any thoughts?
you can keep putting things in the chat, and we'll try to get to them if there's time at the end too. So we're gonna move on to cucumbers, kind of the next big tunnel crop. And I'll get us started and then turn it over to Emma for the varieties again. But I just again wanted to kind of frame this the same way as the cucumbers. Like you can as the tomatoes. So you can grow cucumbers in the field. What is your goal growing them in the tunnel? You have a market for them. When is the market for them? Are you after earliness, or is it just varieties? Again, do you have heat? Do you have lighting? What's your pruning and trellising system? And that's gonna be useful to you figuring out how many plants you can fit in there. And I'll turn it over to Emma there.
Cool. So good spot to leave it because I'll talk a little bit about trellising and printing before we get into varieties. And I'm going to be totally honest with you guys. Greenhouse cucumbers are not a strong suit for me. So I asked actually the person in this picture, his name is Nate. He's our cucumber expert, for some advice. And he sent me over some slides that he had done previously. And they were so good that I copy and pasted them because we probably won't go through all the information in the coming slides, but it's really good information and I left it all.
Quick question for you, Emma.
Yeah.
If somebody calls Johnny's with a question about cucumbers, will they end up talking to Nate? You said it was Nate, right? No?
No, so our research team, like the call center, so the people in the call center and myself are sort of like a liaison between growers and our research team. It would be an exorbitant amount of work for the members of our research team to both do all their research and log all their data and also talk to everybody.
Thank you. And
So
just pro tip anyone, if you want to call Johnny's, they are always great at answering questions.
yeah, we have a really knowledgeable team just in our call center. Actually, a lot of the people that work in the call center work there seasonally in the winter, and they work on the farm and help with a lot of this work in the summertime. So trellising and pruning. So these are Nate's. He has a couple slides here, and he's just talking about how they do it at Johnny's, but the key takeaway here is that if you're going to do cucumbers in the tunnel, you got to get them off the ground. There's a lot of different ways, as with tomatoes, to do it. So the mesh trellis that's referred to here is sort of like that Hortonova. It's got like squares. That's good for field varieties, varieties that just don't get as long and are maybe a little bit bushier. We also could recommend like hanging strings with the clips or the roller hooks. Pruning and trellising, you have to do it, otherwise they get out of control. A lot of greenhouse varieties have really thin skins, and so if you're gonna waste your money with the seed, like just don't do it. If they're on the ground, those varieties are gonna get all scratched up, they're gonna be bent, you're gonna have a lot of culls, and your quality is gonna be really low. And again, your tunnel space is precious. So I would say use it wisely and trellis appropriately. And then just for disease pressure, you're going to get a lot better airflow if you're pruning and trellising. In our trials and in our recommendations, we always say a single leader. And we mess around with, or we trial with and see two main kind of pruning methodologies. So one being the lower and lean, which I'm sure you're familiar with tomatoes. But that's just where you're kind of letting the fruit grow continually up at a curve, and as it reaches the top of your tunnel, you're working against it and lowering the plant. And then the umbrella one is kind of like how you would do with grapes. You just let it go up and then you let it go horizontally. Next slide. So in the Johnny's greenhouses, we do, again, a single leader with the roller hooks. And the lower and lean doesn't work very well because we do a lot of different varieties all next to each other. I think it's usually about 6 plants of each variety in one rep. So there's a high variability of growth rates in those plants. So the faster ones just shade out the smaller ones. So I would say take that into consideration with your variety selection and what you're going to choose. So another option that does work at the research farm is the lower and coil, where they're not, the plants aren't so much at an angle, but they're straight up and down, and they just get sort of coiled at the bottom as you lower them. And this is mostly just important to note for the research purposes, but every other day is how often they're harvesting and evaluating that data. Next slide. So again, kind of what we went through with tomatoes, and like Sue just went through with all those details, in choosing a variety of cucumbers or even just a type of greenhouse cucumbers. What do you want to sell and what can you sell? Are you just kind of starting out and you just want some regular cukes? Then choose maybe, like Excelsior or Katrina or Corinto. If you have a market for, or just really want to try some of the specialty, like oddball stuff, like Quirk or Itachi are going to be a lot of fun. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Next slide, Sue. So first is the American slicer. It's the most popular. You see it everywhere. It's like 7 to 9 inches long, really thick skin. You can leave it in the grocery store for 2 months and it'll be perfectly fine. Everybody knows it. Nobody loves it. It it just doesn't have the greatest eating quality. It's not my personal favorite. Maybe you can tell. But the skins are thick. It's going to be really good if you don't have a high tolerance for really gentle handling the way some of the other types would. So it's going to pack really well. It's going to store well. You can have a little bit more variability between your harvest before they look really monstrous. And these vines tend to be a little bit longer and more vigorous. Go ahead, Sue. So a couple of varieties. I'm actually not familiar with Paraiso. Nate had this in here. It's one he's trialed. It's available at several other companies. And basically the message is that if you can tolerate lower yields and maybe a little bit less uniformity, it's a cheaper option than Corento. Corento is an organic variety that Johnny's carries. It's a really high performer, really nice variety with good high yields and strong plants, but it's not cheap. Next slide. So picklers are really popular, especially here where I am in Western Mass. There's a big Polish population and we love our pickles. But they're really popular. They're another one kind of next to slicers that are just really well recognized, mostly used for pickling, as the name would imply. Shorter fruits. They are typically grown in the field, but there are some varieties that are bred specifically for greenhouse production. And they can also be used just if you want something earlier or if you want improved fruit quality. Most of that breeding is for the European market, so you get that gherkin type, which is just more dimpled or spotty, the way you get those little like spine bumps on them. And the vine type varies greatly with this type. So some are really compact and some are a lot more lanky. And you'll just have to kind of try your varieties and figure that one out for yourself. Next slide, Sue. So some popular ones and ones that Chinese carries, Excelsior has been around for a while. Pretty long vines. 1 fruit per node is pretty standard. Adam gherkin is a more gherkin type. It's very bumpy, a little bit smaller, a little bit earlier, and it also peters out a little bit earlier as types do. Next slide. So now we'll get into what people think of more as greenhouse types. So Bay Alpha is probably the most recognized type, maybe in supermarkets, and especially outside of the US, I think. So they're about 6 to 10 inches long. They're the ones you'll see in those styrofoam packs, all wrapped in plastic. But they're the ones that are sometimes called burpless. They have really thin skins, which makes a really high eating quality, but also makes handling more important. They scratch really easily and they dry out really quickly, which is why they're wrapped in plastic often. And again, the vine type can vary greatly with these varieties. So, next slide, Sue. So some popular varieties. Katrina is one of the most popular varieties that growers I work with use. It's been around a while. It's just a really standard, like medium-sized fruit. It's compact. It yields really high. It's really good eating. I think it's all around a really great choice for this class and just for cucumbers in general. Socrates is a little bit bigger. Nate called it average plants, so shorter than Corento. But that one will also yield well and it tastes really good. And Diva's another one. It's a Johnny's bread variety. It's been around a while and it has really good name recognition, especially for our home gardeners. But please note that Nate did put the line at the end. Please don't grow this in your commercial greenhouse. Next slide. So snackers are becoming really popular. I think it seems to be just a general trend across vegetables that anything small and snack size is very popular and growing in popularity. But these are just mini beta alphas. So same traits, but smaller. Good eating quality, thin skins, high water content. And these are pretty productive plants generally, and they grow quickly. Next slide. So QWERTY is one good example. This is actually a really good example of this variety and things that I've seen too. So really short internodes, so you have not a lot of plant space between these fruits, and they just continually set, and yeah, they yield really well. So other varieties other than QWERTY are mini-me. That's one High Mowing carries it. I've seen it. It's nice. It's a lot like QWERTY, but it's a little less consistent. And I've seen instances of it being a little bit more like bulbous at the end, whereas QWERTY does that a little bit less. But it is an organic option if you need it. So multiple fruits per node, kind of same deal, just a little bit less uniform. And then Piccolino is another one that Johnny's carries, which I'm not sure when. So it says it's a vendor drop, and we have it right now, so I'm not sure when that's happening. Sometimes companies will let us know like years in advance that there's a drop coming. But Piccolino has really high quality dark fruits, and a little bit less compact than something like QWERTY. So next slide. And so the long Europeans are also super popular, becoming super popular anyways. I see them wrapped in plastic every time I go to the supermarket. Same idea, you know, thin skins, good eating, like high water content. They're good like salad cube because you just buy one of them. So I guess I don't, yeah. So the plants can be a bit more lanky, and depending on the variety, sometimes they can bend a little bit, which is another reason that trellising is so important, just to keep that from happening and keep kind of like external stressors away from these fruits. Next slide. So popular varieties, the first two I'm not familiar with, but they have name recognition. They've been around a while. Tyria and Golonka. I think High Mowing are kind of like some of the few that still carry them. Our main variety in this class is going to be Poniente. So it's got longer vines, it's relatively vigorous, has good disease resistance, and generally is just going to be a good choice in this class. Okay, and I think I had one more. Yeah, so I just really wanted to highlight that there are a lot of really fun and funky options out there. We added 3 lime green types to our lineup this year. We have a sour gherkin, we have like a lemon cuke, we have some like white greenhouse types available. So I just encourage you to have a little bit of fun with it and just take note of all the fun options that Johnny's and other companies have available. A lot of these are delicious as well, so they might look kind of weird, but if you can get growers or if you can get customers to try them, you can really get a following with them because they're super tasty and a lot of fun. I think that was all. Oh, you're muted too.
Thank you. So with the varieties that Emma's been mentioning that are greenhouse varieties, a lot of those are parthenocarpic, so meaning they are self-pollinating. And if they do get pollinated, they can actually, that can be negative for them. They get misshapen. So if you're growing these greenhouse specific varieties, you don't need to worry about like buying in bees, and having an open tunnel might not be ideal. I don't see a ton of this, but just want to mention that. And then another plug for the shade here. This is a grower with 30% black shade cloth on their tunnel, and that again, cucumbers also are sensitive to extreme heat. So over 90 degrees, the flowers will be affected again. And just more pleasant working environment. Anyway. Okay. So yeah, we're gonna go through the sort of cucumber planting, production side of things now. So here's, again, this is like the outdoor recommendation. Oh, I didn't know I was drawing. 1 second. I don't want that. Oh dear. Well, anyway, I'll try not to draw all over my slides in the future. You don't want to leave 6 feet between rows in a tunnel, obviously. Again, here you could do the single row or a double staggered row. The same kinds of things that we talked about with the tomatoes are going to apply here as well. So here, this 1 to 2.5 inches of water per week, that is for field cucumbers. We don't have, like, in our guide anyway, high tunnel specific recommendations for cucumbers, but they're growing a lot more, they're yielding a lot more. You can anticipate you're going to need more water, and another way again to achieve that is by adding more drip lines. Recommend mulching on top of those drip lines so that you aren't losing water that way. And of course that helps with weed management as well. Cucumbers are even more sensitive to temperature, so they can't tolerate anything below 55. And again, that upper threshold is at 90. And again, waiting long enough so that your tunnel is warm and the soil is warm as well. So 60, really 70 is the ideal soil temperature for growing cucumbers. So this is me and Hannah, and this is a research trial. We were looking for like bacterial wilt resistance, didn't really find anything that worked, but we were planting later in the season. So it's already really hot in the tunnel, and that's why we were using white plastic. If your goal is early cucumbers, then yeah, you can use black plastic and landscape fabric to heat up the soil faster, or additional heat, air heat or soil heat. Same thing goes here. These are the field recommendations for cucumber fertility, and you can assume you will need more than that in the tunnel if you're letting the plant grow to the max height and lowering it down again. And we don't have great recommendations for that. I'll say in our vegetable management guide, you need to go to a greenhouse tomato guide, perhaps. But that's where the tunnel is a little different because it's not exactly a greenhouse either. So again, getting the soil test and doing tissue testing, fertigating. So front loading your at least half of the fertilizer, and then making sure the plants don't run out of steam and they have enough, again, nitrogen and potassium to continue growing and fruiting at that rate that we're asking them to do. So same idea, and you can use the tissue testing again to catch things before they start showing symptoms on the leaves or the fruit. That's all I have on cukes. And we can do questions here if there are any, or move on to our next crop group, which is like winter.
Don't see any questions right now, but there was a comment from someone that said that the Mexican sour gherkins were super popular at a local nonprofit children garden around where they are.
That's great.
I'm curious to try them. All right, we'll move on. But again, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. All right, so before we get to winter, we got to turn the tunnel over at the end of any crop. So of course you need to get rid of all of this material. It's a good chance to do some pest control. So sometimes, especially if you have a winter greens and you're gonna plant tomatoes and you have aphids on your winter greens, it might be worth treating that crop before you then turn it in. Because those aphids or crown mites or thrips, they're gonna stick around in that residue in that soil and just jump right on your tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever you're planting next. So take stock of where you're at with your pest population and make some decisions about what you can do about it now and make a plan for, okay, if I had aphids on my spinach, how am I going to control them on my tomatoes? And I'll just say that that we were asked not to talk about pests and in this workshop, so that's a whole other can of worms that I won't get into. But I also, again, I've talked about the soil testing a lot, but here is an example of salt accumulating. And this, it's actually burning this spinach and causing this yellowing here, or tatsoi, whatever it is. So be aware of that. And this is a good time in these transitions to flush those salts. So what happens is the salt gets drawn up to the surface through evapotranspiration. And so then you just need to like push it back down through the soil profile by watering it. So running the irrigation for a while, or if you need to reskin the greenhouse, taking the plastic off and letting it, you know, a couple rainstorms, or leave the cover off over the winter, if you can do that, to get some snow in there. And here, I just want to point out, again, this is our experiment, so it's not a normal farm situation, but a lot of people are doing multiple crops in their tunnel. They might have one tunnel and want to do tomatoes and cucumbers, and it's an opportunity to turn things over maybe bit by bit. And that's one way that you can get your winter growing going using successions. So again, same with the tomatoes and everything. Think about your goals here. A lot of people do winter greens, winter growing, because they want to keep employees around. They want to offer customers year-round produce. They want the cash flow in the winter. Whatever your reason is, it might be really different from your neighbor, and it'll affect how you choose to grow. Think about your customers, how much produce they can buy, and when. I just threw this picture in. This is like a local store here where there's just an overabundance maybe of spinach. So make sure that you have a market. I always said that there's no kind of upper limit to how much fresh greens people will buy in the winter, and I still think that's true, but make sure you know your market before you start planting. All right, so again, whether or not you have easy access to frost-free water, if you have heat or not, and how much labor you have is going to determine like the best crops for your situation and how you manage them. So some people want to create work for people in the winter, and that's totally fair. And might lead you to choose, say, doing lettuce, which needs to be covered and uncovered when it gets cold, whereas spinach really does not, at least in Massachusetts where I am, it might mean that you're transplanting spinach instead of direct seeding, or it might change how you're harvesting. People are doing so much in tunnels over the winter, and really kind of pushing the envelope and trying lots of different things. The timing of planting different crops in winter depends a lot on your latitude. So it's hard to give general recommendations for when to plant these things. But the general advice, the earlier you plant, the better or the larger your overall yield will be. And that just has to do with like how much the plants can grow before the deep winter, when they kind of run out of light. And that'll be the most limiting factor. And I'll let Emma take it from here.
Perfect. So Sue was just kind of alluding to what is sometimes called the Persephone period. So I think Elliot Coleman came up with this in his whole winter growing thing, but it's this idea that for winter harvest, you want to plan backwards so that your plants are at least 75% of their desired size before you get to that last 10-hour day of the year in your growing climate. Because once they get to 10 hours, things will still grow depending what crop at different rates. They'll still grow, but it will be really slow. And so we've been talking about this just in our research team, because I think the Persephone period still applies, but there's caveats now because the winters are warmer, temperatures fluctuate a lot, which is a really big issue for many reasons. You know, it can break cold tolerance for some crops. It can mean increased humidity, which is especially a problem if you're dealing with cover. And so for that reason, just for all those fluctuations, it just adds a wrench into the mix that you're going to have to think about a little bit more. But regardless, some crops like spinach are going to grow all winter long. And it might be slow, but they will continue to grow. So I guess my recommendation is use that kind of planning tool or that planning method as a starting point, and just take a lot of notes on what worked. And it might change year to year, because last year I think it was like 70 degrees here in January. This picture I actually just took like a screen grab from the Johnny's website. Again, that'll be a part of the link, some of the links that we send you later on, but there's a lot of information on our website on winter growing. I don't think we have time to go super in depth with it, but it's all worth a read and really good resource. Next slide, please. So I put this in here just to highlight that spinach varieties are really heavily slotted. So that means they're just really specific to what seasons they're going to do well in and what seasons they're not going to do well in. Also important to know, we'll talk about it in a couple slides, but this disease resistance column, it's going to come into play. Let's leave it there. Next slide. So speaking of the slots, spinach is really day length sensitive, more so even than it's sensitive to heat or other stressors. Day length is really important, which is why it's slotted the way that it is. So generally, with a spinach variety, if it's fast growing, it's also going to be fast bolting. And if it's slow growing, it's also going to be slow bolting. So that means that these fast growing, fast bolting varieties are going to be best for the winter when there's really low bolting pressure, but you want them to grow more quickly. So you don't want to grow a fast growing and fast bolting variety in the spring or the fall when days are like the length of the days are changing really quickly, because if they're susceptible to bolting, they're going to bolt during that time. So this kind of day length sensitivity means that when days are changing really, like the length of the days is changing really rapidly in like early May, varieties are going to be more susceptible to bolting during that time, even than they will be during like an 80-degree period in June, because the length of the days is changing less quickly. Next slide. So another thing to think about with spinach varieties is disease. Downy mildew is a huge issue depending who you are and where you are and on the year. But it's always an issue regardless. It's also the reason that you see spinach varieties come and go so often. So the economic driver of spinach breeding is probably like the California, like Salinas and Yuma area, because that's where most of the spinach that you see produced that ends up in the supermarket is. And because they have such high disease, because they're growing so much there, they have such high disease pressure there, which means that the varieties need to keep up with the disease pressure. And so varieties are just constantly being introduced in hopes that they can be resistant to those varieties, which means that so our Rachel is her name. She is our spinach expert, and she year-round is seeding spinach variety trials. And she'll seed up to 50 varieties in a trial, and oftentimes like half of those varieties will be dropped before they're even brought any further in that commercialization process. There's just so much material out there, which is good because we always have new genetic material and better disease resistance and better varieties. But important to know if you're really attached to one variety. So one thing to take into account with this is, so you can see in this chart, it's kind of cut off from the names, but it's called races of downy mildew. And so I think it's really important to diversify your variety selection. So try and pick a couple varieties that will cover all of those numbers. Because it oftentimes like you'll get one race, but and so like one variety will go down, but it'll keep you safe because you have another variety. And if you do get downy mildew, take note, because then in theory, you will be able to know what race you got and therefore what varieties you need to choose in order to not have susceptibility on your farm. Another disease, cladosporium, it's tough. There's not a lot of resistant varieties out there. We did add Garanuk this year, which maybe it's one of the only varieties out there with resistance. And it's worth a try if that's an issue for you, because I've seen that become more of an issue in recent years. Next slide. So for smooth leaf varieties, I really would recommend Auroch. Tragopan is going to be the replacement. I'm not sure when, but it's just another one of those things. The vendor is moving to Tragopan. They're super similar. You might not know that they're different if we didn't tell you, but we're legally required to tell you. So it's the fastest growing variety, and so it's going to be really high yielding. It's really upright, which makes harvest really easy. You'll see in this picture here that it's already a little bit angular, and with successive harvests, like the more you cut it, it's going to get a little bit more pointy and angular. And the leaves, it's one of the ones that does it the most, but the leaves will actually kind of like exude little crystals, you might notice sometimes, but they do wash off. And I would assume if you're growing spinach, you're going to have to wash it anyway. So it shouldn't be an issue, and it's still edible. Another thing to note just with smooth leaf varieties in general is they will get a little bit more savoyed in the tunnel or like as you go through the winter. That might not be a bad thing because they might not stick together quite as much. It'll give you a little bit more loft in the bag. Next slide. So savoyed leaf spinach, we added Rancho Todo this past year. It's a really nice variety. It has resistance to most strains. Garanuk as well has really broad resistance and cladosporium resistance. Sun Angel is actually probably never going to go away. It's a really popular variety in the hydroponic space. So that's kind of like a safe bet. But we do also carry Tarsier, which is basically a one-to-one, like identical sub. And we just carry both of them to have redundance in our lineup because spinach is so important to our growers, and so we never want to run out. But those are both really good options and worth trying. Next slide. So for spring harvest, you want to be planting probably like February because that's when growth will really pick up. But Colibri and either San Angelo or Tarsier are going to be the best for this slot. They're they're a really good combination of both tolerant and fast growing, which is kind of a mix of those traits that we were discussing earlier. Another one that's just kind of like a wild card, if you want to go nuts, is hammerhead. So it's really fast growing, but it's also probably our fastest bolting variety. In trials, sometimes Rachel will put it in as the check for bolting. But if you're looking for like a one and done, like a really big harvest, but you won't get a second harvest out of it, you could do hammerhead if you really wanted. But otherwise, I would say that's not recommended. I just thought that was a fun tidbit to put in there. Next slide. It's your turn.
Okay, that's it for the varieties then. So just quickly going through how to establish this a winter spinach tunnel. Can be a little finicky. It doesn't like to be too cold or too hot or too wet or too dry. And the P is very sensitive to pH and wants a very neutral pH of 7. It really spinach is a cool season crop, and we're growing it in the coldest of seasons, but we're planting it in the tunnel in like September. It could be over 100 degrees in there. The soil could be pretty hot. So I think that's one issue that we can have if you're direct seeding spinach for sure, or maybe even getting transplants to germinate uniformly at that time. Again, before you plant, make sure you know the nutrient status of the soil, including nitrate. So on a routine soil test, you have to check the box if you want to know the available nitrogen. And that's because it's so mobile. Nitrogen is so mobile in the soil. If you test it in the fall, by the time spring rolls around, it could be really different. So there are times when it makes sense to add nitrate to your test and times where it doesn't. Before planting a relatively speedy and low nutrient demand crop like spinach, it's going to make a big difference. Also, fertilizing crops over the winter is a bit tricky, and there hasn't been very good research on this topic. So some growers are just putting down tons of extra fertility because organic sources of nitrogen, they need to be turned over by microbes in the soil. And if the soil is cold, the thought is that process won't be happening or will be happening more slowly. So people are just putting down like tons of extra, which might be fine. But then in the summer or in the spring, when it heats up again, all of a sudden, all of that nitrogen might become available, and we could see burning of crops in the spring. You could see leaching of that material. So what we do, so I'll say that on my team, we've been doing winter spinach variety trials for the last, I don't know, 6 years or something. And we do direct seed. And this is our fertilizer program. We're just fertilizing the crop and nothing else. So we look at the nitrate and we put down spinach requires like just 20 pounds of nitrogen. And so that's what we put down. But then we do continue to test the soil and side dress or fertigate with nitrogen as needed. And so the way that you do that is if you want to just test nitrate, you don't have to get the whole routine test and add it. You can just take a PSNT. It stands for pre-side dress nitrate test. And it's like $15. You send it to the soil lab and they'll turn it around pretty quickly. And it only tells you nitrate in parts per million. And so we use this periodically throughout the winter. You could also just side dress after each harvest. But the rule of thumb is if the nitrate is below 30 parts per million, then you would do a side dress. This is our direct seeding rate. It's pretty dense. And the reason for that is we're trying to mimic a mechanical harvesting in our trials, and it works pretty well for us. And what else did I want to say about that? Oh, more plants is more yield. So number of plants in, yeah. So also we did this whole like cost benefit sort of enterprise budget thing with winter spinach, and ways to increase your yield, just harvest a little bigger. It's obvious, but when you're direct seeding, your biggest foe is going to be damping off, and that'll it's a soil-borne disease, a couple of different pathogens that are just kind of ubiquitous, and they take advantage of things, especially when they're growing slowly. So in our trials, one of the things that we are most interested in is how quickly the seed germinates and how well it does growing in the tunnel at this time of year. Damping off is, yeah, the biggest, has the biggest impact on stand. So a lot of growers are transplanting instead. So here is kind of just the comparison of plant density. These were 6 inches apart, rows 6 inches apart, transplants. Some of the benefits of that, you can turn the tunnel over in a day. So if you have tomatoes in there and you want to let your tomatoes go as long as they can and still plant spinach and harvest it by Thanksgiving, you're going to want a quick turnaround and a jump on your spinach. So that's a good reason to do transplants. Again, the earlier you plant, the more yield you will have over the winter. And so transplants can get you an earlier first harvest and just increase your yield potential. But you can make that up in plant number, I think, direct seeding. But you'll have less damping off because you have the roots are bigger and more established, and the damping off can kill emerging seedlings before they even pop up. But it is more costly to produce, like significantly more costly, the labor and materials to grow the transplants. And so a lot of people are using paper pots kind of in between solution.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Someone has heard of using vermiculite to help with germination in transplanted spinach. Have you tried this, or has anyone tried this?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear from other people in the chat. Certainly in transplant production of vegetables, small seeded things rather than cover. So you make the hole and put the seed in and then cover it with potting soil. If it's a small seeded thing, vermiculite is an improvement, I think, because it's easier for the light to get in and the seed to germinate. So it's used pretty widely in just like greenhouse seedling production of anything, not necessarily spinach in particular.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to anyone, there's about 10 minutes left in the workshop tonight. So if you have any questions, now is the time to ask. So feel free to put them in the chat, and Sue, I can interrupt you again if you want to keep talking about your stuff.
Just like 2 or 3 more slides. So
okay, great.
We'll have time. Again, whether or not you have labor and you want things for people to do might influence how you harvest. Again, thinking about this ahead of time. Yeah, and so that will determine your planting setup. these are some of the different ways people do it by hand or various levels of mechanization, these drill powered greens harvesters from Johnny's, for example. So yeah, the idea here is you're planting the spinach in the fall and it's and you harvest it and then it regrows 3 to 5 times over the whole course of the winter. And in that way you have like a continuous supply of greens over the winter. And so you do that by planting successions and or harvesting in successions. I think we mentioned that this is a very labor intensive way to harvest kind of leaf by leaf, but a lot of people do it. This is how we do it by hand, and just kind of clear cut. And as long as you leave the growing point, it just grows back. And this is where you might want to take a soil test and see if you need additional fertility here, or just go ahead and fertigate if you don't have the wherewithal to do a bunch of soil sampling, which I can identify with. When you're doing winter greens, you do still need to wash them. So again, you need that access to water in the winter and a warm enough place where you can do this without making people crazy. People are doing all kinds of stuff besides spinach. We didn't have, it's a big kind of topic. So we decided not to cover other winter crops. But folks are certainly doing all kinds of stuff, especially lettuces. The lettuce, so spinach can freeze, and as long as you don't touch it when it's frozen, you can harvest it later once it's thawed out. Up to a point. I think if we're in a long period of single digits, you may want to cover the spinach as well. But lettuce needs to be covered more like at 25 degrees. And so then you end up with like covering and uncovering every night, depending on where you are. And that's a lot of labor. It's not very fun. And you end up with a lot more disease when you have to cover, because there's just moisture builds up in there. And so you really don't want to leave the covers on. So that's where this becomes like a high labor crop pretty quickly. And again, people are doing all kinds of different stuff, and they all have kind of different growing requirements. People are playing with the planting dates for different things. And this is where there's a lot of like grower to grower learning. And I think on the next slide, this was a workshop that I went to last winter where growers were sharing a lot about other winter crops that they were growing, and I would recommend if that is what you're interested in. But that's what we had prepared, and yeah, we have time for questions now. And this is where some of the presentations that I mentioned from the recent conference will eventually be posted. And here is a QR code for the Johnny's Winter Growing Resource Library and our contact info. And we'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Sue and Emma. There is one quick question in the chat right now, and the temperatures that were on the previous slide, was that covering temperatures or not covering temperatures?
Yeah, like temperatures at which those plants need help surviving covers. Yeah. And that's kind of a rough guide of, sometimes it depends on how quickly the temperature changes, how long it stays at that temperature. So I don't want to suggest that this is like the temperature Bible, but this is from my gleanings, a rough guide. But
Great. I don't see any other questions popping up right now. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Sue and Emma for a great presentation. You guys are both very knowledgeable, and I learned a lot tonight. And if anybody has further questions from them, their contact information is up on the slide, and I'll be sending out a recording of this usually in a few days with any links that were mentioned while we were talking. And there's another question that just popped up. For the materials referenced, do you have the ability to translate them into different languages?
Yeah, often, depending on the language and the resource. But if there's a certain resource, I'd say for UMass extension anyway, if there's a certain resource that you would like to see in a different language, just send us an email requesting it, and we will do our best.
Thank you, Sue. All right.
Yeah, and folks can like unmute if they want to ask a question. We can stay a couple more minutes, but
I'm getting a lot of thank yous. And thank you guys again.
Thanks,
Okay.
everyone. This was fun.
yeah, thanks Emily for putting it together.
Yeah, thank you guys for chatting. I always learn so much from these workshops. I'm like, let's put it together. It's so fun. And then I get to learn a bunch too. It's great.
All right, well, we'll get you a list of our favorite tunnel growing planning resources.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. I don't see any more questions popping up. So if you have more questions, you can either email me and I can pass along the question to Sue or Emma, or you can take down their email addresses or phone numbers here and send them a message. So thank you, everyone. And I'm really excited that you all came tonight.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.